You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Zach Bechtold and Matt Franks. If you'd like to learn more about the Bearded Theologians, you can go online at beardedtheologians.com, where we have past podcasts, blogs, and a couple items for sale. So check us out, beardedtheologians.com. Thank you for listening, and enjoy this week's show. You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Matt Franks
and Zach Bechtold. And today we have a very special guest with us. Today we have Tony Jones. Tony, thanks for being with us, man.
My pleasure. Great to be here, guys.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us, a little bit about who you are, where you're from, what you do?
I live in Edina, Minnesota. That's a suburb of Minneapolis. I have a wife and 3 kids. They're all home because of the virus, my college kids. So I'm cooking and doing a lot of dishes. It's crazy. What do I do? I'm a freelancer these days. I've kind of gone in and out of jobs. My story is I grew up here in Minnesota. I went to college out east. I went straight to seminary. I went to Fuller Seminary in California right after college. And then when I got out of there, I worked for 3 years for a youth mission organization called YouthWorks, helped to launch that deal, and lived on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. Then I got a job as a pastor at my home church, which is a Congregationalist church. So it's kind of like a UCC church, but it didn't join the UCC during the big mid 20th century mergers when all the denominations were forming. I worked there for 7 years. That's when I started writing books about ministry and prayer and ancient spiritual practices and stuff like that. And then I went to Princeton in 2003 for a PhD, which I ultimately completed in 2011. Wrote about the emerging church. That was, of course, those years I was heavily involved in the emerging church movement we had a pretty good 10-year run, of being church famous. And then that ended. I worked in publishing for about 10 years, part-time and then full-time. And then for the last year or so, I have been totally freelance, just writing, launched a podcast, working on some other creative projects on the side. I don't know, we're hanging out, raising my kids, training my dogs, stuff like that.
Awesome. That's a whole lot.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I've done a lot of different things, It's funny. I never thought that I would probably be a seminary professor. I've done that. I teach at Fuller Seminary now. I'm just starting a new Doctor of Ministry cohort, actually. It just launched this month. And we've had to, of course, rejigger everything and change when we're going to meet or whatever. But I don't know. I've gone back and forth. There's a lot of there's very few jobs, and there's a lot of people with PhDs in theology like me who are underemployed. So I guess I do coach some other almost all guys who are in the same boat as me and try to encourage them to be more entrepreneurial and try to be gig workers and figure out ways that they can take their education and their experience and do other interesting things with them. So, you think of guys like Tripp Fuller, who started Homebrewed Christianity, or I've got friends like that who are Peter Rollins, we're those of us, we talk a lot about doing stuff that makes the world a better place, but isn't in those traditional avenues of get a job teaching in the seminary or whatever. And I guess I could always go work at a church, but dude, when's this podcast gonna air?
Maybe today if I get it all put
okay.
together.
So it's gonna air during coronavirus.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, you guys. Do you think people are gonna come back to church after this?
I think we're going to see a couple different things.
Okay.
I think we're going to see some folks come back, but I think we're going to see folks take advantage of the technology as well.
I see pastors on Twitter or whatever, on Facebook, people I know, and they're, saying, "Oh, I can't," when we're going to see a surge when people people are going to realize how much they miss church, and they're going to all come flooding back. And I don't think so. I honestly think people are going to realize they didn't miss church,
Right.
and they're not going to come flooding back.
Right.
And the other thing is, even what I read this morning, like, churches are being implicated in the spread of this deal.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost every hotspot in the country. Like, there's a big blow up going on right now in France, and it seems to have been its genesis was at a evangelical megachurch in France. And now France is like right behind Spain in this massive outbreak.
Right.
So anyways.
Yeah, no, and that's and that's been some of the conversations that I know we've, in the circles that I've been running or having conversations in a lot lately, is what's it going to look like? How, what, with some of that stuff, like, how do we handle how do we respond when you have those idiots? And they're idiots. I mean, at that point, they're idiots. I mean, allowing not taking care of your people is idiotic and irresponsible and really poor stewardship of people. And how do we respond as pastors, with that? I mean, the first week in Oklahoma was really March 8th, and I was the only church in town that had shut down.
Yeah.
And everybody else was still meeting. And we caught a little flack for it, but my whole deal is my job is to take care of people. And if I would much rather talk to them on the phone when they're at home than them, being in a hospital on a ventilator. And, and I've had to, stay firm in that, because it seems like people are, pushing back now. Well, it's changed a little bit now since it's since in Oklahoma, we're continuing climbing. Yeah. Our governor prides himself on being a top 10 state, and we're in the top 10 of this. And so we love being in the top.
You guys are wasn't your governor out at selfies of his? Yeah. I mean, between Tiger King and your governor, you guys are, that's rough. Right. It's rough in Oklahoma right now.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun being in Oklahoma for sure. I've been asked a lot more questions about things that I have no clue about, because it's not my culture.
And as you should. But you bring up a good point of, when this is over, right? When the pandemic's over, whenever that is, we cannot, as a church or frankly as a society, push back to go, well, we got to get back to normal. We got to get back to the way things were. Especially as the church, I think we have to begin to embrace what is and what is going to come of this.
And I think
how do we continue?
A lot of churches are just going to not reopen. They're going to close because they're going to run out of money, and they're popular. I mean, let's talk about, just like your denomination in the UMC, what's the average size of a congregation, and what's the average age of a congregation?
Yeah. Average size, 50 to 100 probably, for most.
And the age of the average parishioner is what?
50 to 100?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just, I think a lot of restaurants aren't going to reopen, and I think a lot of churches aren't going to reopen, because they were already running on a budget that probably wasn't sustainable in the long term, and this is just going to accelerate their demise. I'm guessing. I mean, this is just a hunch. I don't have any data necessarily to back that up.
Well, and it's always hard to predict that stuff and how people will respond. I mean, it's just, I think the one thing it's doing for the church, and this is something I've definitely have had Zach and I've talked about this many times. It's allowing us to look and see what we do and what we can let go of, and what we can, when we do get to be back together physically, what are some things we want to hold on to that are healthy, and then those things that we've either had to cancel or we've had to, we're shuffling around, scheduling, asking ourselves, is this something that's really worth the time and energy, or can we look at doing some new things and share how we're doing some new things? I think that's hopefully pastors will do that with their teams and figure out how they can, maybe maximize their effort coming back when we can meet again and say, hey, that thing we were doing that nobody came to, let's, when it comes back around next year, we're not going to do it. And I think that this is allowing us to have that space to do it. Not necessarily in the way that anybody ever would want to, but I think in a way that will allow some things to be let go of. And some of those, you've been around the church in different ways, and you've seen those holy grails that people lean on, that people spend more energy and time in, and, it's not necessarily worth it as much as other things could be. And
well, how about this? I mean, what's like, is the ecclesiological bureaucracy going to rethink things? Because here, when your district superintendent calls you later today, please tell me they're not still moving everybody around in June. They're like, the UMC has got to rethink this itineracy thing during this, right?
You'd like to think so.
You would like to think so.
Come on. Are you kidding me?
So I know Zach and I's conference is now moving July, and I mean, that's still doesn't matter. But there's been some conversations, but I mean, it was kind of one of those things that when the ball started rolling before all this hit, and it was hard to stop, like, to say we can't do it, even though we now, like,
everything else in our culture has stopped. How can
why not this, right?
If the NBA and the NHL can stop mid-season, I think the UMC can tell people to stay put for a year,
right?
For a while.
Well, yeah, and when one would hope that, but like and I don't know about Zach's conference, but I know in our annual conference we had a mass amount of retirements, and so it's the shuffle game, and you start one, and it's crazy, but. No, and I think there is some of that. I know they're not making as many, but they're making the ones that they have to make because, we've had retirements, and when it's kind of hard if that's my understanding from having conversations before. Yeah. I mean, and there are some ways. And one of the things I have to say though, that's been fun is, getting, and I can speak to this a little bit better because Zach's conference was doing this way better than we were. Was the telecommuting is now happening more in Oklahoma than it was before. And that's nice. I mean, I have to admit, I live 3 hours from Oklahoma City and an hour from Tulsa. And so if I'm having to, go to a meeting in one of those two places, I'm giving up almost a whole day. Yeah. And now when I have those meetings, people are slowly learning how to use this technology, and it's I don't have to go anywhere. I can stay from the comfort of my home or office. And that's been a nice bit of creativity that I think that's been a part of this, because it's been hard for me to push that.
Right. And you guys got to put off your big divorce by a year.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And, honestly, that has relieved more stress than anything else. Is we were ramping up, talking about it, and then now we're not talking about it. It is no longer the most important thing in the room. What is keeping people safe, keeping people healthy, and making sure that we're doing everything we can to bring God's love and grace through that, rather than focusing on this really divorce. Yeah, that's clearly the perfect word for it.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I'm in Minneapolis, and of course we're hosting the big general convention, and we also hosted the ELCA big convention, whatever it was, 10 or 15 years ago, when they voted to stay together and allow gay marriage and gay ordination in their churches. And the Methodists, you guys, I mean, is it because it's more global? Is it because of the Methodists, the Methodist UMC churches that are in different parts of the world that are more inherently conservative on issues of gender and sexuality?
That has some to do with it. That has some to do with it. Money and power and position have some things to do with it. Yeah.
What do you guys make of like the big UMC churches like Adam Hamilton and Mike Slaughter and Will Willimon and those power players who kind of tried to broker a truce and were unsuccessful? Is it because they don't have as much sway in the denomination as some people thought?
I think it was because in certain places in the world, they don't necessarily know who those people are.
Okay.
And so while if you're in the United States and you don't know who those people are and you call yourself Methodist, you really might want to look at your card again, because I mean, you just named like the power people.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's enough people there's enough on the other side of the globe that don't know. And I say the other side of the globe, I mean, that's really kind of how it feels.
It seems that the Institute of Religion and Democracy is able to get in touch with those people on the other side of the globe, and right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah.
Well,
it's always like conservatives are always more coordinated, it seems.
100%. Yeah. They seem to be a little more coordinated, a little more well-funded. Yeah. And that's what we've seen in the last however long, but especially in the last 4 years, is a very concerted effort to consolidate, to come together and say, this is what we're going to do. And you've seen the WCA come out of it, which is very well funded, very well put together, and is pulling on all of these other strings, calling little churches that may not be open after this, right? And likely wouldn't have been open after if this wouldn't have happened, and just pulling on those things, saying, well, come with us, and then we're going to leave you behind.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting. And I've been asking people who don't understand the intricacies of Methodist polity and all the fun things that I usually say, have you ever watched a dumpster fire? I mean, have you ever really watched a full dumpster fire, like from beginning to end? That's how this is going to be. And it's going to be a mess. And it sucks that we have to wait a year, because I want this done so I can move forward in the ministry that I'm doing. And I'm not feel like I'm having to continually come back to this and continually telling people in the LGBT community no when I don't want to tell them no. And I need to be able to move forward. And I feel like I feel like at least in my congregations, we've hit a point where like we want to be able to move forward and we know we can't, and we're stuck. And that's enabled us in our community to be able to be the force, the feeling that we really feel called to. And so I hate to admit, I'm ready for it to be done so we can move forward.
Right.
But
sure.
I also don't feel like having a global meeting in the middle of May, in the middle of a pandemic, is the wisest thing to do, contrary to how some people feel.
Really? Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of pushback on it. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, if everything were lifted in April, like, at the end of April, like they're saying, it may happen, there would be people that would push. And even though I know that that's not going to be
no
reality,
way, just in the Minneapolis paper today, the mathematical models they're running in the Minnesota Department of Health say that we're going to hit peak between May 15 and June 15.
Yeah,
is going to be peak here. I would think Oklahoma would be similar. It's moving from the coast toward the center of the country.
Mm-hmm.
We were one of the first. And so like we had some of the first cases, at least known. And so we're kind of we're a week behind Seattle is basically how we've been operating in Oklahoma.
Okay.
Our governor hasn't been, but for the most part, the state has been.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, and I'm in Montana. And so we're 2, 3, 4 weeks behind all of that.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's fascinating.
So Tony, you've got this you've got this new podcast out. And so talk a little bit about the podcast for us.
It's called the Reverend Hunter Podcast. And, it grew out of, I went through a really bad, rough 10 years of my life and lost basically all my credibility in the church world based on going through a bad divorce and then having my ex-wife write a bunch of stuff about me on the internet. And all of it was not true. I ended up being awarded by the court full custody of my 3 kids. She ended up leaving the state and has no contact with 2 of the kids and limited contact with the 3rd. But none of that mattered in the church world. Like, that stuff was about me on the internet, and that was enough to basically end my writing and speaking career in the internet. In the church. because of what people read on the internet, which is like, I get it. I understand that, the church world is a particularly, I'm going to even use the word industry. The church industry is particularly sensitive to that kind of stuff. For good reason, and I understand why. But what it caused me to do was I really needed to figure out a different avenue or a different way to both practice my spirituality and to try to use the gifts that God gave me, which include writing and speaking and communicating. It's what I love to do. And during those really bad years, I found a great deal of comfort and spiritual growth outdoors. We own some land up in central Minnesota. Our family does. I spent a ton of time up there, and I took up hunting as an adult. When I was around 30, I just started dabbling in hunting a little bit. And then for like the last 10 years, starting in my 40s, I just turned 52 a couple days ago. And in my 40s, I got really into hunting. It just became the thing that brought me life. And not only in my connection with nature and the wilderness and my dogs that I hunt with and stuff like that, but also when I would go hunting, like when I would go out to South Dakota and pheasant hunt and end up in a cafe with a bunch of dudes, they didn't give a crap what the internet said about me. They did not care. All they cared about was like, is he a safe hunter? Does he have good dogs? Is he a good guy to have a beer with at the end of the day? And it's funny, I used to, travel. I could list off a dozen names of like people who are Christian famous, church famous people who used to be my very best friends, and talk to them, weekly. And all those people faded away from my life. And the people I was spending time with then became people you've never heard of before, names you never heard of and never will hear about. So that was all a long journey for me. And I was really out of the public eye for many years and just had my head down, working in a publishing house, raising these 3 kids, trying to get them launched into the world. And so now 2 of the kids are in college. I left that publishing job, and I just wanted to try to put words to this thing that had given me so much comfort and helped me grow spiritually and personally, and that's being outside. So I launched the Reverend Hunter podcast. I've written a memoir that my agent is currently shopping that's about this, that's tentatively titled The God of Wild Places. Mm-hmm. And I've just reflected on how my outdoors life has filled a lot of like in the book, I talk about how when I was ordained on September 7, 1997, and I was given this robe that, the deacons of the church we wear black academic Geneva gowns. That was our tradition. So people who think like Presbyterians or Calvinists, that's kind of the look, So I remember being given this gown, and they put this academic hood over my head, which we also wore academic hoods in worship. And it just meant everything to me, because it's everything that I had been going for in my life. Since I was in 7th grade and first said I was called to be a pastor. And how that robe now sits in my upstairs closet in my house, in a garment bag, unused, and how like my liturgical vestments now are a hunting vest and like canvas double tin chaps, and a blaze orange cap or whatever. My shotgun, my rifle. So anyway, that's kind of a long, meandering explanation of how I ended up here with this new podcast. And so far, we've released a few episodes. I'm interviewing people on the podcast who also find some kind of spiritual meaning outdoors. And I mean, yeah, that's what it's about so far.
I love that, because I find living in the part of Montana I live in, we're just an hour and a half from Glacier. And so we're right on the Rocky Mountain front. And often when I see people in community, when I first moved here a couple of years ago, it was, oh, sorry, Pastor, we didn't come to church this weekend. We were up hiking. Great. Please go do that. And still get a lot of that. And I'm like, stop apologizing to me. You don't owe me any apologies. Go and be in those places. Find God there, because I guarantee you will. Why not go and connect with nature in this way? I really, since moving here, I have been exploring so much of that theology of the fullness of creation, and trying to get people to remember that it extends far beyond us people, and into the fullness of what God creates. Plants, animals, dirts, mountains, water, everything, right? And I think giving people that permission to go, oh, hey, go and be in these places, go and do these things, and find the ways that you connect to God in those moments, and the people that you connect with doing it, and stop apologizing to the pastors and priests and whomever because you weren't in the building on Sunday. I'm happy. Please be there. Go and be in those present in those places, because that's equally, if not more, important.
Yeah, in a couple of weeks, I've got an interview that will drop with Nate Pyle, and he's a Reformed pastor, RCA, I think, in Indiana, and he has written a couple books. One's called Man Enough, and it's like rethinking masculinity away from the traditional. He's an evangelical guy, but on the more progressive side of evangelical. And he's also a deer and pheasant hunter. And we had this really fascinating conversation talking about how he's an archery hunter, and that takes an extraordinary amount of practice. Like he's constant right now, we're 6 months from any open hunting archery season. And he's out there almost every day practicing with his bow. And he talked about the sacramental nature in the interview. He talked about the sacramental nature of bow hunting and the spiritual discipline of practicing with that piece of equipment on a daily basis, which is something that I had not thought of before. It's kind of fascinating stuff, But I've also done a lot of thinking about hunting, for instance, is an inherently violent activity. Like you're killing, you're out to kill an animal. There's bloodshed involved. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And my latest book, the last book I wrote that was published in 2015, is about the atonement and about how this very violent act stands at the center of an otherwise peaceful religion. So anyway, I find a lot of intersections for me with that. And then there's less kind of like overtly spiritual connections, because I think a lot of people of our, you guys are probably younger than me, and then even people younger than you are really interested in where their food comes from. They're interested in more kind of naturally harvested types of meat, stuff like that. I mean, Montana is a mecca for like the most popular hunter in America is a guy named Steven Rinella, who's in Montana. His podcast, Meat Eater Podcast, is wildly successful, and he's got a TV show on Netflix.
That's right, yeah.
And it's all like younger, hipster, bearded dudes who, it's so different from the traditional old school conservative hunting shows. It's about having respect for the game. It's about how you prepare the meat after you harvest it, things like that. So there's kind of an interesting turn happening in the hunting world, and what I didn't hear as I was getting more involved in that world, I did not hear anybody talking about the spirituality of it. And yet when you ask people, I mean, there's some statistic I read on the Pew website about Americans, like 70% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 49 feel a sense of wonder at creation when they're outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
People above the age of 49 to 70, it's less than half that. So there's something about in this, like the spiritual but not religious category, or the nuns, they still find some kind of spiritual connection outdoors. And, I just want to like catalyze a conversation about that.
Yeah. Oh, and I think that's a great thing. I mean, I know I've already recommended your podcast to a couple of people that I know that would connect well with it, because that's who they are. They're hunters, and they've said the things like you've just said, and like, hey, you should listen to this. I think this would be a good thing. And that's kind of one of the things that we do here. We've got some people that would, fit in that, that's what they're looking for and longing for.
Yeah.
And so to be able to connect them with your podcast, I think is a great thing that we can, try to, help do. I mean, and, we wanted to be able to do that. And I think, you definitely hit on some things of wanting to be connected to nature, and that longing for that, for people, in that younger demographic. And I see it time and time again. And I think that's kind of one of those untapped fields that we're not talking about enough, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think that's right. It's interesting how little you hear about that in church. I think about how little you hear about being outdoors and stuff like that, when it's so important to so many people. It's just I just think it's where a ton of people really find connection, figure out who they are personally. And the second episode of the podcast is an interview with a guy named Lan Tawney, another Montana guy who is the president of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, which is the fastest growing conservation group in the country. And he's a guy who, by the way, he turns 45 tomorrow on Friday. And he talks in my podcast, and gets a little choked up about his dad died when he was 45. Mm. And he loved his dad and has a super intense relationship with his dad. And he talked about rushing home from college to see his dad, and his dad dying right then, like right after he got home from school. Mm-hmm. And he walked away from the church and walked away from faith, mm-hmm. in that traditional theodicy way. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Why if there's a God, he wouldn't allow stuff like my dad dying to happen. So I'm out. Mm-hmm. And we had just had a fascinating conversation about that, and about how he finds connection, even though he still has this like nostalgic love of the church he grew up in, and even talked very admiringly about his pastor from growing up, but he just can't see himself going back into the church world.
Right. Well, and I think there's probably more of that, right? People who have walked away for whatever reason, but usually losing a loved one early. Why is this? Why would God let this happen? If you look at the current predicament that we're in as the church, how do we begin to connect with, we have to connect with people outside the church now, because we can't gather in it. Right. And so we have an opportunity to do things differently. And not only doing our church services and things like that, but encouraging people to find God wherever they are. In connecting these pieces of folks saying, man, when I go out and I hunt and I see these things, I'm seeing something, right? Yeah. Whether they're going to name it as spiritual, whether they're going to name it whatever, but they're connecting in this way. And so how do we begin to tap into that and say, well, what about this? Mm-hmm. Have you seen it this way? And I love the idea of the liturgical vestments being the bright orange vest and hat. And I mean, there's that. that's the world I live in, right? And I've got people who will go and stand in their tree stands on Sunday morning and make it back into church, or give me a text message afterwards. Hey, sorry, no. That's where you were. That's where you were. That's fine. Just be present in those moments, because you're gonna find God there, and just be open to that, and be willing to quit worrying about me and my feelings as your pastor, and just be present with where you are and how that spiritually fills you up.
Isn't that funny? I mean, I remember when I was going to seminary, and then when I was serving as a pastor, there was, I mean, I can see why we inculcated that in people's imaginations, like they have to apologize for not being at church on Sunday.
Right.
Because we were raised to do ministry, like you need to follow up with people when they don't come to church. You know what I'm saying? You need to figure out why they're not there. And now it's hard to relinquish that. But if they don't come to church, if they're not coming to church on Sunday, if they are choosing instead to take their family on a hike in the mountains, or to go sit a ridgeline and look through their binoculars for an elk that they're trying to hunt, what's the role of the church? Like, how does the church stay in business in that environment with those kind of people? What does the church have to offer? Or how does the church offer them something that is still relevant to their lives? You know what I'm saying? Like, if you, Zach, as a pastor, are saying to a guy like, hey man, it's no sweat, don't come, like, you go be on your elk hunt, I'm cool with that. But then what is the role of your church in that person's life? I mean, it's not a leading question. I'm like, literally, honestly, I don't know the answer to that.
Right. And I don't know that I do either, outside of just community, right? Because I see so much of what at least I do in the church is gathering in community, whether that's in the building on Sunday morning, or in the bar on Tuesday night, or in the coffee shop on Wednesday morning, wherever it is, or just, going out and riding in a combine with somebody, finding ways that we can connect as community, that doesn't depend on the building, but also involves it, right? When it needs to, and when it can. But forcing people who aren't connecting with it to try to walk through the doors and force this connection isn't working. And so for our folks that aren't walking through the doors, that aren't connecting with the physical church space, how do we offer them that as well as community beyond where we sit in the neighborhood?
Like, I wonder, so what part of Montana, what part of Montana are you in?
So North Central, we're just south of Glacier on the east side of the mountains.
Okay, cool. All right. I wonder at a church like yours, what would you be able to offer an outdoorsy person, like a hunter or hiker or something like that, for them to integrate their spirituality into that outdoor activity that they're involved with? If it doesn't involve them going to a worship service on Sunday morning, because of course that's, for a lot of us, weekends are just one of the only times we get to pursue those outdoor activities. I wonder what resources we as the church can offer people who are living their lives more outdoors and are less inclined to come to a weekly worship service. Maybe it's podcasts, right? Maybe it's written materials. I for sure, I agree that the community, I think especially, I was going to say especially in more rural areas, but I think it's everywhere that the church community fills a need. But I just also wonder what other resources can we offer those people to help them integrate some kind of theological reflection into their outdoor pursuits.
And I think you're right. I think right now, today, podcasting is one of the main ones, because you can go, you download it, consume it wherever you are, whether you're in a tree stand or in your pickup or hiking, wherever you find yourself. Something we're going to try to do, knowing that people like to be out. We're going to do some guided hikes with communion and, a little bit of devotional and reflectional about what's around us this summer when we can get back in the mountains. And to my knowledge, that's not something that's been done in my church in its 110-year history. And it's one of those things, like it's here in front of us. It's right here. And so how do we offer that is the exact question, right? What are the things that we're doing that still connects people in, even ever so slightly?
Well, that was a question that we've been kicking around here. What are some ways that we can, where I live in Tahlequah, it's the most beautiful part of the state, and so we have lakes, and people hike and kayak and all that stuff, and so how can we engage people that are doing that? And this year, when hunting season was around, one of our hunters came to me and he said, I wasn't at church on Sunday. I said, I know, it's hunting season. I didn't expect you to be at church on Sunday. I expected you to be out hunting because that's what you do. He said, I was, but I also want you to know I still took the live stream with me, and I was listening on my earbuds as I was sitting in my deer stand. And so it allowed us to have some legitimacy in the live stream because people were critical of it, and it wasn't at that time, it wasn't really huge. Like we had about 10 to 15 people joining in with us, and those were people that were connected to the church in some way, shape, or form. But what it did for us unknowingly is it set us up for this moment that we were already ready to do church online. And that's we've had to make a few adjustments, but we've been able to reach out to people who were taking us to maybe they were going to go kayak that day. And so instead of being at church, they were out kayaking, but yet they still felt connected to their community. And I think that when we can bridge that gap, when the church actually does that thing and actually goes out and, brings community to the community that they're around, it actually is being the church in the best way that it's possible.
Yeah, I tell you, I've had some great experiences. I mean, the moniker Reverend Hunter came from when I was just like losing all my gigs and really still wanted to preach and be out there and meeting people. So I posted a thing on my blog. This might have been like 7 years ago or something. And I said, I will preach anywhere for free in exchange for hunting. And I started, some dude from Tulsa, some Episcopal priest from Tulsa actually reached out to me, and I never ended up going down there. I don't know, we could never figure out the timing or whatever, but I started going out to the Dakotas, and I would preach at these little churches, like 15 people there on Sunday. You know what I'm saying? Really in small towns, struggling little churches, but incredible, my experiences at these places. Like preach, then there's a potluck supper, downstairs, and everyone's just loving the community and being there. And then I get to, duck hunt with people from that church for 4 or 5 days afterwards. And so anyways, for all your listeners out there, that is still an open offer, including for you two guys who both live in places where there's good hunting. I don't really need invitations to come to New Jersey or whatever. But, Montana and Oklahoma, I would definitely be keen to come and preach in exchange for hunting. And I ended up writing about that in the Minneapolis newspaper, and the editor gave it the headline Reverend Hunter of that story that I wrote. And so that's how that name kind of came and stuck. And then I decided, well, what the hell? I might as well buy reverendhunter.com and start to build a little deal around that.
That's kind of how our podcast started.
Right?
We did the same thing. Someone acknowledged that we had beards and we should just be the Bearded Theologians, and the domain was open, and so we took it.
And then we felt justified we had to use it. So
now now you dudes like gotta keep your beards.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's been some fun moments when you are, when you're trimming up, you like go very carefully making sure that, there's not going to be a razor mishap and you're having to, start over again. That's definitely been some fun times.
Had to buy a new domain name after that, or just Theologians after that.
Well, they're saying too that, now they may be pushing us all to start wearing masks because the countries where people wearing masks have much lower distribution rates of the virus. But I mean, the masks, the thicker your beard, the less effective the mask is. So I don't know, guys.
I choose quarantine.
I will choose isolation to the best of my ability.
Over shaving.
Shaving.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair. That's
how it goes,
No, I'm down with that.
And as an introvert, that's just more heaven for me. So
right.
Tony,
that's too funny.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for your time, man. I know. I know it was a random email that when I saw that you had that, and I was like, man, I want to see if we can get him on the show. It'd be good to talk to him again. You and I have had many times we've crossed paths in different ways back in the days, and I've always respected your work.
Thanks.
Your Soul Keeper book has been one that three of your books still sit on my shelf that I use quite frequently for all different things. And the ones on spiritual practices definitely are ones that I share with my youth ministers when I have them and say, hey, like, these are the things we probably should be, you need to be thinking about. And so you definitely have been an influence on my ministry. And so I just, need you to know that. And I'm glad you're able to join us today.
Hey, that's super great to hear. I really appreciate it. I through this, 30-year journey of doing ministry, through everything I talked about when we started, whether it was doing mission work on an Indian reservation or writing those early books and speaking at the youth specialties conferences, or the whole awesome 10-year run of the emerging church movement. And I did the Church Basement Roadshow one summer with Mark Scandrett and Doug Padgett. I mean, I've met incredible people. I've such great respect for so many people who are doing ministry, like you guys who are in churches, ministering to people. It's really why, like I was saying, when I go out to preach in little churches in this hunting exchange thing, I absolutely love it. And there's a huge part of my heart that lives in these small parishes that are ministering to people faithfully over many, many years and decades. So I right back at you. I'm thrilled to be on. Come on anytime. I appreciate your interest in my podcast, and I hope I hope people find something valuable from it.
And you can find the podcast at most places you can find podcasts, correct?
Yeah, my kids, it's so funny. My kids were, I was like, we were all in the living room because they're all home now from college for this quarantine deal. And I'm like, everybody pull out your phones. I'm like, everybody subscribe to my podcast and get 5 stars right now. Cause I'm like, I got 5 people right here in the room.
That's right.
And so my kids start typing they don't even really know how to spell Reverend. They're like REVE. They're like, oh my gosh, you're the top result on the autofill.
Nice.
That's like being the world's tallest midget. I don't think there's not a lot of competition for podcasts titled Reverend anything. So you can find it at reverendhunter.com. You can see some stuff I've written there. But yes, anywhere. I'd love for people to listen to the podcast. If people have ideas, because I've been getting ideas from people of guests I should have on the show. I'd love for people to pitch in. Coming up next Monday is my interview with Jessie Diggins, and she is a gold medal cross-country skier. She won the first ever gold medal in cross-country skiing in the Olympics for the United States.
Awesome.
And she's a pretty and has overcome an eating disorder to do it, and she's a pretty intense person. So it was a fun interview.
Yeah. That's awesome. We'll make sure to get the links and everything up in our website and podcast and everything too.
So yeah, thanks Tony for being on. And so for the Bearded Theologians, I'm Matt Franks.
I'm Zach Bechtold. Thanks for checking us out. Thank you for listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share on all social media outlets. You can check out old episodes and more information at beardedtheologians.com. Thanks for checking us out.